Curious Lloyd.
With all the propaganda, prejudice, and humanity's tendency to reduce the complexities of history to Michael Bay films, World War II remains one of the most understood wars ever fought. If you're a history buff or a really old dude with a hell of a life story, you might already know some of the following things. Hitler was in undisputed control of the German military. Hitler wasn't the military genius pop culture usually portrays him as, but at least the guy commanded some loyalty, and we know he was a captivating leader. Most of us have seen those videos of him delivering terrifying, passionate speeches to the tune of righteous cheers. But actually, shockingly enough, being cuffed in the ears by Nazis every time you stepped out of line wasn't openly embraced by 100% of the population. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was fiercely loyal to the state, but harboured a deep-seated distrust of politicians and their shenanigans. Erich Raeder, the Grand Admiral of the first half of the war, actively resisted any and all attempts to Nazify the Navy, and gained some notoriety for his 2-hour shouting matches with Hitler. After Raeder's inevitable resignation in 1943, his more Reich-minded successor allowed the Nazi mentality to seep in, but even he continued to keep the party at an arm's length. The Navy even had a rule that people who joined had to leave the Nazi party before taking part in any missions. But that didn't mean the Kriegsmarine were passive-aggressively condemning the evils of Nazism. They were mostly just too Christian and conservative to buy into this new wave of Nazi stuff. Still, the Navy was an apt breeding ground for the dissenters like Admiral Canarius, who collaborated with the generals on the Eastern Front to use a wine bottle to blow up Hitler in 1943. But speaking of the Eastern Front, invading the Soviet Union didn't go well for the Germans, and the troops' opinion of this supreme commander was directly proportional to the depth of the hellcreek they found themselves in. Starting in 1942, the Wehrmacht began taking Soviet citizens to bolster their ranks, and when Hitler told them to stop recruiting racially inferior people into his army, the officers politely told him to bugger off. By the end of 1942, 700,000 of the 3 million soldiers in the Axis army were Soviets. Additionally, a type of German machine gun called the Sturmgewehr proved invaluable on the Eastern Front after it was developed against Hitler's orders. So basically, disobeying Hitler was the main reason the Nazis didn't lose the Eastern Front so quickly. Nazi war prisoners got what they deserved. The myth was, being a Nazi prisoner of war must have been rough. How could it not have been? Look at what they did to the people they put in the prison camps. But what actually happened was, tons of Nazi war prisoners virtually got away scotch-free, and the Americans helped them. America took in over 400,000 German prisoners, and an estimated percentage of who the hell knows were unrepentant Nazis. The US had relatively little experience dealing with the prisoner of wars, and the sudden influx of up to 30,000 of them per week required quick thinking, so they rounded them up, took them to a bunch of prison camps, and treated them super fine. They were fed well and even given wine and beer with their meals, because it's always a great idea to give alcohol to hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on your soil when your own army is on another continent. The prisoners even got pretty well along with the locals, and the moral wacky misunderstandings, but there was some forced labour, but even that was strictly governed by the Geneva Convention Accords. Paid, and mostly the kind of manual labour, farm work, etc., which they were used to anyway. The most common stated grievance was boredom. As such, escape attempts remained minimal, and some prisoners stated that their life in a prison of war camp was way better than it had been back in the German military. After the prisoners were returned to their war-ravaged homeland in 1946, some of them kept in contact with the American friends they had made, and many eventually returned to the US. Ironically, these positive US and German relations, along with the CIA, enabled thousands of registered Nazis to eventually settle in America and gain citizenship. But the US didn't get blitzed or anything, so it makes sense that they'd go easy on the Nazis than the more involved nations, like the Soviets. You'd think that, and you'd be wrong. In 1943, Stalin gave orders that the treatment of all Axis prisoners, including Germans, be improved. As a result, Axis prisoner of wars had it better than the Soviet civilians while in captivity. It's a wonder surrendering didn't become the hottest fad in the Third Reich years earlier. World War II was a big worldwide war. The myth was that World War II began when the Nazis invaded Poland and ended when the United States nuked Japan. Sure, it may not have become a Hollywood World War II until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, but the point is, if the Second World War were a tombstone, it would read 1939 to 1945, and its cause of death would read America. But actually, what we handily label a giant globe spanning World War II was in fact a whole bunch of different conflicts, occasionally fought completely independently of each other over the course of more than a decade. Attempts to pin down a specific starting date is a matter of dispute among scholars, but the German invasion of Poland in 1939 is a narratively convenient way to kickstart the story with the European main villain's first major power play. But that was still a local thing between two countries. You could arguably have the stronger case that the war became truly global in 1941, thanks to Pearl Harbor and Hitler's invasion of Russia. Or you could take things back a bit and note that there were way worse things going on globally well before the Nazis curb-stomped the Polish. The equally conquer-happy Japan had already locked into the Second Sino-Japanese War with China since the summer of 1937, killing more than 20 million Chinese, and almost whom weren't civilians over the course of that 8 years. Who says stuff like that doesn't count? Not even the Soviet Union suffered that many civilian casualties. Speaking of 1937, that was the same year Italy joined the Anti-Comintern Pact between Germany and Japan, effectively forming the Axis powers. At that point, Italy had already been in a full-scale war with Ethiopia for nearly a year, their second war for a decade, and Russia and Japan had been waist-deep in a series of serious border clashes since 1932. What the Western world labels World War II is more of an era in history rather than a singular conflict. If we view it as such, then the war was already underway, complete with armies, navies and war crimes for nearly 2 years before Hitler even managed his way into chancellorship. The Axis were the ones committing the war crimes, while the Allies tried to stop them. This was the myth. It's not like the US or the UK ever did anything bad during World War II, never mind anything comparable to the atrocities of the Germans. The Allies were fighting to put an end to the stuff. But actually, please bear in mind I'm about to discuss a bunch of war crimes committed during the single most violent situation in human history, so be warned. Those were a fraction of 18,000 to 25,000 civilians killed during the bombings of Dresden, a wholly unnecessary air raid carried out by more than 2,000 US and UK bombers for the purpose of exploiting the confused conditions of the terrified city. Dresden was one of the many cities subject to such bombings by the Allied forces. But that's enough about bombings, because there are so many other atrocities to talk about. There's the interment of innocent Japanese, German and Italian civilians by the US and British and even Canadians, rampant massacre of captured soldiers and civilians, Allied troops collecting gold teeth from corpses and keeping Japanese skulls as trophies during the Pacific War, which I previously mentioned in my creepiest stories in the history of war video. The list goes on. The atomic bomb was the end of the war. The myth was, even if the entire conflict is hard to pin down, we know exactly what marked the end of things on the Pacific front, but I can hint you it was with a bang. But what happened from Japan's point of view? The A-bombs that America dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were essentially grenades, terrifyingly destructive ones, but far from enough to immediately make them roll over. According to Japan's own leaders, the moment they knew they lost the war had less to do with the atomic bomb, and more to do with America's heavy overall bombing campaign of the summer of 1945, which killed more than 250,000 people and injured hundreds of thousands of more. That's more casualties than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. That was the point at which the Japanese knew they had lost the war, though not the point of surrender. Instead, they attempted to negotiate an armistice that would preserve most of the empire's pre-war borders and protect their emperor from incrimination of war crimes. Since such terms did not even passingly resemble surrender, President Truman rejected them. It was going to take something bigger for Japan to quit warring. And no, Hiroshima still wasn't enough, or Nagasaki. It took the atomic bombing of Japan and the surprise Soviet invasion of Manchuria on the very same day as Nagasaki to convince Japan that tapping out was an acceptable option. Back in February of 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific Theater, which he did with a spectacular military maneuver. 1 minute after midnight on August 9, 1945, the same day the Fat Man bomb dropped, Stalin shoved a ridiculous 1.5 million men, 3,704 tanks, and 3,721 aircraft to Japan. The atomic bombings of Japan were a horror show, but ultimately, it took a carefully planned joint effort between the US and the Soviets to truly end the war. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week. And the sudden influx of up to 30,000 of them per week required thick thinking. Thick thinking, quick thinking, fucking mong.